So I'm going to start off with a question. When was the last time you received one of these, a standard letter? So it might have been a speeding fine, maybe an insurance letter, maybe a letter from your superannuation fund. It could have been anything. I'm sure that most of you will have received one of these recently. I know I certainly have. No speeding fines though, thankfully. So governments use these standard letters for several good reasons. They maximise efficiency when communicating with large numbers of clients. They ensure consistent communication and they provide clear written records. But I'm going to show you today that standard letters can actually have other benefits beyond merely being efficient means of conveying information. If optimised using behavioural science, standard letters can actually improve government's efficiency and efficacy, and they can motivate citizens to perform several socially beneficial behaviours. So a little background on standard letters. Just want to make a couple of points. First, there's a lot of standard letters. Now that might sound a little banal at first, but it's actually important for a few reasons. So because there's a lot of them, that actually means that they're the main way that government bodies, and non-government bodies for that matter, interact with the general public. So there's a lot of opportunity there to influence the behaviour of large numbers of people. Another point about standard letters is that they're not often written as well as they could be. That's an actual complaint that was received about a standard letter. So one of the things that makes them not well received sometimes is that they are sometimes perceived to be cold and lacking in empathy. So research suggests that a lot of the time government letters are perceived in that way. Another thing about standard letters is that they're often not written in the best way possible. So they may be unclear. They may use overly complex language, perhaps legalese, which really dilutes the clarity of the message that they're trying to convey. But why standard letters? Well, in short, standard letters are important because they allow us to influence behaviour, and when there's a lot of them, we can actually measure our impact because we can do randomised trials to actually see if changing letters actually has an effect on behaviour. So BehaviourWorks has worked on several letters projects. We've worked with WorkSafe to improve the clarity of letters used in assessing injured workers' eligibility for compensation. We've worked with the Environment Protection Authority, Victoria, to increase the amount of people who pay their litter fines. And we've worked with VicRoads on a few projects, and those are the ones that we're going to be talking about today. So, the first case. So I'm going to talk about two cases. I'll talk about the first one, then I'll hand over to Praveen to talk about the second one. So the first one is the case of medical reviews. So when VicRoads receives a notification from a doctor or a police person or a community member, they have to investigate. And the first step in that investigative process is to send the driver who's been alleged not to be medically fit to drive a letter asking them to go to their doctor to fill out a medical report. Now, one thing that kind of surprised me about this when I first started on this project was that under half of the people who get sent this letter don't supply their medical report by the due date. That's pretty astounding, given that this could result in their licence being taken. So our task was to increase this number, basically. How did we go about doing that? Well, we basically used a three-step approach, very similar to the one that Liam described earlier. So the first step was to try and understand the problem. So we did a literature review of research that had been done in other areas about how to use letters to influence behaviour. We also examined complaints that VicRoads had received about the process to see if there were some hints about why people might not be complying. And we also analysed the existing historical data to see what sorts of things predicted whether a person submitted their report on time. Was it old people or young people that were more likely, etc. So then on that basis, we developed an intervention. And specifically, we focused on these two concepts when we were developing this intervention. So these concepts were procedural fairness and simplified messaging. Procedural fairness is really just it's a bit of an academic term which it captures essentially the fairness of the process. So if people perceive a process to be fair, they're more, they're more likely to comply with it if they perceive the process to be fair. So in earlier work, it had been shown that you could increase the amount of people who pay their taxes, for example, by including some messages to explain why the process was the way it was. The other technique we used was simplified messaging. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but essentially that involves just putting the key messages at the start of the letter, writing the letter in a very clear and simple way. And then finally, we test and measured whether our changes were effective, and we did this using a randomized trial. So I don't expect you to be able to see these letters, but I'll zoom in on parts of them. So the letter on the left is the old letter, and the letter on the right is the new letter that we revised using behavioural science techniques. I just want to point out a couple of things. So the first is this point here. So we made it really clear. We made it really clear and simple what they needed to do. So we had these two headings: what you need to do, when you need to do it. Pretty straightforward, but it's been shown in previous research to have an effect. And then we also, to increase the perceived fairness of the process, we included a few additional headings. So we explained why we were sending them the letter, and we explained why suspensions would be imposed if they didn't comply with the process. So it's just about giving them the information they need to understand how the process works and hopefully understand why it's a fair process. We also tried to increase what's known as interpersonal justice. So to try and express understanding and empathy with the situation they're going through, because this can be a very tough letter to receive. Could be the start of a process which may ultimately lead to your license being removed and your freedom being taken away from you. And so we added this additional section which explained, essentially, that just expressed understanding that we know that this letter can be tough for some people. So it's just a few simple changes, right? What sort of effect would you expect that to have on compliance rates? So they start off at 49%. In our trial, we got basically the same result for the control letter, so that was the business as usual letter. For the new letter, increased to 62%, so it's about a 22% increase. Now that sounds nice, but it is nice, but that translates into some very important practical outcomes as well. So if this letter was applied to all VicRoads letters requesting a medical report, we'd get close to 7,000 additional on-time submissions each year. We'd have roughly a 20% potential correspondence cost reduction. So this is a reduction in the costs of actually following up with people who don't submit on time. There'd also be improved road safety benefits, because what we found was that people were submitting these medical reports faster, which means that their claims can be assessed more quickly, which means that unsafe drivers would be taken off the road more quickly, and thus there would be less risk, we'd be improving road safety in that way. And finally, and this is an important point, we would have fewer suspensions for failure to provide. And that sounds potentially good, and it is good, but it actually has some very important benefits, like social benefits for the people going through the process. Because we know that if you have your freedom to drive taken from you, it tends to increase depression and negative outcomes like that. So by reducing the number of people who are suspended, we can potentially improve important social benefits. On that note, I'll pass over to Praveen, who's going to tell you about the second case, registration renewals.
Thanks, Nick. The second case in point that we'd like to bring to your attention, where we've used the science of behavioural insights and nudge communications to effect better customer outcomes. predominantly in the regulatory compliance space was in relation to payments of their annual vehicle registrations. Now, we have available data to support that 70% of all Victorian citizens pay their annual registrations on time, but 30% of the citizens don't, right? So this could be for a variety of reasons. We know that the annual registration bill is a substantial bill. It's close to about $770. And it could be issues of cash flow. It could be issues of people coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds. Whatever the reason may be, data suggests that we have a good 30% who don't pay their registrations on time. Now, in the spirit of innovation, and given that this trial happened last year, we didn't have the expertise of behavior works on board. So I'd just quickly like to share with you the approach that was taken by us in terms of running a small randomized controlled trial. So like I said, we didn't have behavior works. All that we had was access to a lot of literature in this space, and also some case study examples of similar interventions that had happened in the UK and the Nudge Unit. We also partnered with our another partner at the Transport Accident Commission to come up with certain messages which would influence better customer outcomes, especially in the space of annual registration payments. And we decided that we'll have a randomized control trial of just about 5,000 letters, given that this was an entirely new space for us. We didn't want to go big on volumes, so sort of we'll keep it restricted to 5,000 letters. We'll come up with 5 different messages. So the 4 messages would have some behavioral insight science with them. And the 5th message would be your control message, which is pretty much the message that's used on our registration renewal notices now, which is saying goodbye to your reg stickers. So it was decided that the variable messages, the 5 different messages, would sit on the top right-hand corner where all our messaging sits in a current renewal notice as we know it. And those were the 5 different messages that we collectively came up with. And I'll briefly go through each one of them just so that you know the science behind that as well. So the first one there was around a road safety message, which is pay now and stay safe. And the theory that we used there was the deterrence theory, where we are focusing on negative consequences. So basically alerting customers to the fact that if you drove your vehicle unregistered, you may be liable to fines of up to $700. So it was a nice little catchy message, thinking people would read that and think, oh shit, if I don't pay my registrations on time, then I'm liable to that fine. The second one was largely around keeping your family safe. So we thought this message would resonate with families. It's predominantly using the prevention focus theory, where we say, do the right thing, pay it on time, and make sure your family is safe. So we thought that would have an effect. The third one was around reciprocity norms, and this is where we say, you do the right thing by us and we'll do the right thing by you. So by paying your registrations on time, we will ensure that your family will be covered in the event of an accident, should that happen. And the last one was my favorite one, which I thought was the real sweetener in the deal, where we would offer an incentive. So we partnered with Tourism Victoria to say, hey, how about you provide us a free holiday somewhere in regional Victoria, and come up with a message where we said if people paid their registrations a couple of weeks before the due date, you would go into a draw to win a 2 nights free stay at the Vibe Hotel in Marysville, and see the terms and conditions at the website. Pretty good messages, you would think, given that these were just messages that were, they had minimal scientific thinking. We didn't have Nick on board at the time, and just out of interest, just a show of hands, how many of you would have thought that message 4 would have worked with the majority of Victorians? Which message do you think here would have worked? Let's put it that way. 1 and 2? All right, let's have a look at the results. So that was the control message, which was saying goodbye to your reg stickers. Pay now, stay safe was the message that performed the second best. Sorry, I lie. Keep your family safe was the message that performed the second best. the TAC payments was the one that performed very well, and sadly, the Marysville one that performed the least. And I was trying to rattle my head why this would be the case. It probably because we ran the trial at a time where it was not school holidays or people didn't want to avail the holiday. So that could potentially be the reason why that message didn't work. But what did this all mean for us? We saw a 2.3% increase in on-time payments for the most successful message. So in a typical renewal notice batch, we have about 100,000 letters. That potentially equates to 2,300 more on-time payments. It has a road safety message in there where you'd have fewer unregistered vehicles on roads, and it improves road safety outcomes for Victorians. And it has the potential to collect roughly about 4.5 million on-time vehicle registration payments. So what's next in this space for us? Like I said, the trial was very small. It ran for 3 months, and the control size was 5,000 letters. But now that we've seen some results with this small trial and we've got the expertise of Behaviour Works on board, we are going into a second trial where we're going to be increasing the sample size to 100,000 letters. And we have developed about 9 messages which have some really good scientific thinking backing that up. The trial will go live next month, and it'll run for approximately 3 months. And if I get an opportunity again, I'll be happy to share the results with you of that second trial. On that note, I'll pass it back on to Nick just to share some of the key lessons that we've learned on this journey.
Thanks, Praveen. So overall, I mean, really, I just want to make a couple of, probably 3 points. And if you take nothing from this presentation but these 3 points, that'd be great. So the first point is that optimizing letters using behavioural science, it has benefits to government in terms of efficiency, but also to society in a number of ways because it increases the efficacy of our programs. It's also low cost, but potentially very high gain, as particularly Praveen's demonstration example demonstrates, rather. But another thing to note, and this may have come out when Praveen asked you to predict, which message was going to be most effective. It's very difficult to tell which message is going to be most effective. And it's very important that you actually do rigorous trials to evaluate the efficacy of any changes you make. Just because something's worked in another context doesn't necessarily mean that it will work in your context. So it's always critical to trial these letters. And on that note, I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.